What does drone warfare really look like right now? That's what this conversation is about. I speak with Sam Bendett, who's an advisor with the Center for Naval Analyses and a non-resident fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's one of the world's leading experts on Russian weapons development and drone warfare in Ukraine. We discuss the systems that are currently being fielded, the scale of drone and AI operations, and what life is really like right now for soldiers and drone operators in Ukraine. This is the Escape Sapiens podcast. If you enjoy these conversations, the best way to support them is by subscribing. And now, here's Sam Bendett. I hope you enjoy.
Escape Sapiens.
So let's start by setting some context for the discussion. When it comes to drones, what are the systems currently being fielded by Ukraine and Russia in the Ukrainian conflict right now? Just in broad strokes.
There's multiple types for multiple mission sets. So at the very tactical level, there's lots of light quadcopters, both military grade and lots of commercial grade. There's the ubiquitous DJI Mavic drone, which is a Chinese-made UAV, which is still used in large numbers by both sides. There are also FPV-type drones, the first-person view, the racing drone that has become sort of the new face of this warfare for all manner of tactical missions. There's lots of multi-purpose quadcopters used for observation, reconnaissance, intelligence, to deliver munition drops, to conduct strikes, to enable with logistics and supplies in some capacity as well. There are fixed-wing ISR drones, or intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance UAVs, used by both sides to conduct overview beyond the 100-kilometer mark and everything basically within that range. There's lots of fixed-wing UAVs, which now are one-way, sort of kamikaze drones, short distances, long distances. There are, of course, long-range one-way attack drones used both by Russia against Ukraine. That's the Iranian-provided design, which has since become a Russia's own drone. It started out as a Shahed, now it's a Gerань, and its companion drones, Gerbera and others. And Ukraine's growing roster of one-way attack drones with a significant range that can reach Moscow from Ukraine and lots of different industrial and military targets. So when we talk about drone use in Ukraine, we're talking about a comprehensive use at practically all distances, at all altitudes, and for all kinds of missions. We should also mention that both sides are using some of the legacy platforms that were developed before this war for additional intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and guidance, and occasional strikes. So we have a very large number of UAVs in this war, and you can't really read an article about this conflict without actually coming across a point that UAVs are very important in this war and what kind of role they play.
Can you give me a sense of scale, though, in terms of, for example, casualty numbers? What percentage are coming from drones and UAVs and sort of unmanned systems?
It probably varies by section of the front. It varies by mission sets. It varies if you're talking about tactical close-range combat versus soldiers which are more removed from the war. From the line of contact, from the direct contact with their adversaries. I think it's important to acknowledge also that in this particular combat and at this stage in the war, the observation that is enabled by drones is practically ubiquitous. It is practically everywhere during the day and at night. So you can't mass your forces in large quantities anymore. You can't mass your soldiers in large quantities anymore. You can do a lot of things that were normal for militaries around the world before February 2022. And so if you are moving in combat, if you are moving in a vehicle, on foot, in a small group, in a large group, if you are fielding a system, chances are you will be observed by a UAV, you will be tracked by a UAV, and you will be attacked by a UAV or a follow-on artillery or mortar strike. So again, casualties can vary depending on the adversarial ISR capabilities and depending on the adversarial drone capabilities. They also vary depending on the soldiers' counter UAV practices and technologies and counter UAV tactics, techniques, procedures, and concepts are evolving as quickly as the UAVs themselves. It's a technological race between the sword and the shield, the proverbial race that is raging for many, many thousands of years, and it is playing out in this war as well. So there are units which are well protected by counter UAV systems that conduct good counter UAV practices, that have experienced commanders, and then there are units that have less of that. And so again, casualties can vary depending on these factors.
Mhm. So, can you give me a sense of what it's like on the ground for an infantry soldier? So, someone who's in the trenches and at the front, how do drones affect their day-to-day lives and how they operate?
Well, it's a very tough physical and psychological environment. Every public account, every public analysis of life in the trenches is basically one of very significant stress. The adversarial UAVs can be anywhere and everywhere at once. They can show up whenever. So you have to be constantly ready to track adversarial drones or counter adversarial drones. This has led, as I have mentioned, to changes in how soldiers operate and how they build their trenches and how they operate in the trenches in the dugout and how to protect themselves, their units, their positions, how to conduct specific camouflage, how to move, how to maneuver. All of that has been impacted by the possibility that you and your unit and your soldiers and everything that you have can be potentially observed and attacked by a UAV. So again, it's a very stressful environment which necessitates soldiers to constantly monitor the skies. And so this involves a range of systems and technologies, range of observation tactics that normally should work together in a system, but it doesn't always happen like that. There's not always a very unified and well-organized approach. And so again, the quality of life in the trenches can depend how close you are to the line of contact, where you are across the front, how well experienced your soldiers are, and what kind of defenses you put into place.
Are we seeing? You mentioned stress. Are we seeing new forms of PTSD from soldiers coming back from the front?
Yes, there are videos of soldiers basically trying to dig themselves into the ground, filming themselves in the trench with an FPV drone circling above, and it makes that very specific
Mm.
whining sound. And the sound increases and decreases depending on how close that drone is to that position, whether it's taking turns or slowing down. And so there's that sort of sound, that constant stress is now part of the front. There's also PTSD with civilians who are targeted by drones. We've certainly seen a lot of stress amongst the Ukrainians who are under constant barrage by Russian long-range UAV strikes. When people have to anticipate attacks from the sky at any given point, it certainly generates a lot of stress on one's ability to cope with it. And so everybody copes differently, but this ability by FPVs and quadcopters to stalk each individual soldier day or night certainly generates a lot of stress. And this is kind of the new type of PTSD. We haven't even seen or really considered the overall effect of this because the war still continues. The veterans have not come back from the front in large numbers. And certainly those that do exhibit stress from the need to constantly monitor and defend themselves against this very nasty threat.
Hmm. So then, when it comes to the operators, the men and women who are actually driving these drones, what does a typical mission look like for them? What does life look like on the ground for an operator?
Well, the operators are one of the key priority targets for the adversaries because the best way to get rid of drones is to get rid of the experienced operators. If you get rid of the operators who can pilot those systems, you can ensure a gap in the adversarial capabilities. So drone operators are very much high on the target list. So they have to practice their own safety measures, their own camouflage measures and tactics that now exist for them to do launches and retrieval and movement in a very specific fashion. They too have to hide. they too have to move very fast. Each drone that you see in Ukraine may not be piloted by a single operator. In fact, it could be an entire crew that's helping that one specific drone pilot. So an FPV strike, for example, is normally filmed by a companion quadcopter or fixed wing ISR drone. So that's one pilot. The FPV pilot concentrates on flying towards the target and cannot always see what's happening around. And so an FPV drone pilot often requires this type of overwatch. So that's two people. A drone crew often requires its own engineer and sapper, someone who can attach munitions, someone who can deal with different types of munitions. And a drone crew often has its own engineer or someone who can fix things if they break. Certainly with a rapid pace of use of different types of drones, there's a need for people to repair or fix any breaks or any problems right there at the front. And sometimes there's a separate driver who drives a crew to and fro. Sometimes one of these pilots can actually be the driver himself. So we are talking about a group of people behind every mission or most missions. There are, of course, missions that are conducted by solo pilots, but very successful strikes happen as a complex, sort of multiple drones functioning as a system. And again, they have their own instructions on how to launch their UAVs, how to retrieve their UAVs, how to move around, how to mask their position, how to mask their antennas and signal repeaters, and other aspects. And so they are primary targets. They are very important targets, and a lot of time and attention is devoted by each side to trying to understand where adversarial drones are launched from, how to track those positions, and to strike drone pilots and obviously drone crews.
So then, what are the main lessons that have been learned in terms of how survivability? So are we seeing drone operators or teams moving from location to location very rapidly? What are the main countermeasures that are put in place to stop strikes on operators?
Well, for example, the launch point cannot be conducted close to where the pilots are. And so one of the key recommendations is you have to quickly run and launch your UAV and then run back. Your position should be several hundred meters away. If you have to operate other systems, you usually run a cable that could be several hundred meters long as well from your position. You have to choose a very good hiding spot in a building, inside structures, inside the foliage, or use natural surroundings to mask your position as much as possible, because your adversary is going to look for possible and probable launch points. And at this point, 3 years into the war, there's a lot of experience with trying to identify and understand these launch points and possibly strike them, even if there's no one there, just to get rid of an opportunity for your adversary to launch their UAV. Again, they have to rapidly move on foot or in a vehicle from place to place so that they don't linger for too long. If you linger for too long with your UAV crew or by yourself, you will probably be identified and attacked either by an adversarial UAV or an artillery or mortar strike.
So you make it sound as though there's operator on operator conflict, right? So there's a cat and mouse game between both sides where operators are targeting each other.
Absolutely. Experienced drone pilots can take out a lot of manpower and a lot of equipment. And there are teams on both sides that have hundreds and maybe even thousands of kills by themselves or with their UAV crews. So there's a lot of emphasis placed on trying to get rid of those crews and to deny the adversary the ability to launch drones in such a successful fashion.
So another thing you mentioned is, well, when we spoke about stress, I imagine there are a lot of friendly fire incidents, because if I was a soldier in the trench and I heard a UAV over the top of my head, I wouldn't want to wait to see whether it's from my side or the other side. So is that what we're seeing on the ground? Quite a lot of friendly fire incidents?
Exactly. A lot of analysis about UAV losses deals with this fratricide, and a lot of it is due to friendly electronic warfare jamming, as well as soldiers shooting a UAV. And this, of course, is due to lack of communication at the
Mhm.
front between and among units. And this is a problem for both sides. It's more of a excuse me, it's more of a problem for the Russians. But like you said, a soldier doesn't have the time to figure out whether the UAV above is a friendly or non-friendly. Again, there's not always time to communicate back, and the soldiers that launch and UAV crews that launch their UAVs also don't often communicate their intention and their concepts and tactics to other units in the area. And so those drones are lost in very quick succession. In fact, it is likely that the majority of all losses is owed to this fratricide and a lack of communication, followed by electronic warfare and other counter UAS jamming by the adversaries.
And so then who has the technological edge in terms of what can be deployed right now by Ukraine and Russia? Because I know that Russia is being sanctioned, right? So I'm wondering what limitations that places on what they can actually field. So if you were going to give the edge in terms of technology and numbers, who would it go to at the moment?
I don't think I could make that assessment right now. Both sides are fielding a large number of UAVs. Both sides are fielding um, rapid changes, technological, conceptual, tactical changes to their UAVs. Both sides are fielding long-range UAVs in quick succession. They're fielding mid-range and tactical UASs and small range UAVs. I'll give you the numbers. For example, the Russian defense minister says that his military is using anywhere between 3,500 to 4,000 UAVs daily. So that's up to 120,000 UAVs per month. And the bulk
Mhm.
of those are, of course, short range tactical drones, including FPVs. Ukraine is using at least as many.
Mhm.
So it's not about who is better, it's who has the edge, who has the new tactic, and who can use that tactic very quickly before the adversary gets wise to develop the countermeasures. For example, Ukrainians were the first movers in using commercial quadcopters like Chinese-made DJI drones. They were the first to field FPV type drones, but those tactics were quickly copied by the Russians. Russians seem to be the first movers in fielding fiber optic controlled drones, which is now sort of the new technology to evade adversarial electronic warfare, to provide better situational awareness, to have a better picture to target. Ukrainians copied that very quickly, so both sides are now fielding fiber optic controlled drones. So again, it's not about who is better specifically, it's who can use the technology very quickly to their advantage.
When you say fiber optic controlled, do you literally mean there's a cable hanging behind the UAV being dragged through the air?
Yes, yes. There's a spool with a fiber optic cable which is attached to a UAV, and it provides anywhere between 5 to 20-kilometer range. There are, of course, benefits and detriments to using fiber optic controlled UAVs when compared to regular radio controlled drones. But we're seeing more fiber optic controlled UAVs as a way to evade and avoid uh, electronic warfare jamming altogether. So Russians are using it in the Kursk region. They're using it in other parts of the front as well. And again, Ukrainians are now building that capacity against the Russians as well. The biggest advantage of an FPV drone is you have a very clear picture of target up to the second of detonation. And that's not the case always with the radio controlled drones where you use the signal at the terminal stage. And so you're not always
Mhm.
sure if your drone actually attacked the target or fell somewhere near, etc. So fiber optic UAVs are sort of the new thing right now as a counter electronic warfare measure, as a way to be more accurate and more successful. There are nuances with flying fiber optic controlled drones because you do have a cable behind you. You want to avoid the cable breakage, entanglement, and so on and so
Mhm.
forth. But again, we're seeing this tactic on both sides right now.
I want to get on to countermeasures in a second, but before that, just in terms of supply, are both sides able to supply at the level they need primarily domestically, or where are these drones coming from primarily on both sides?
Well, a lot of these UAVs are actually manufactured domestically, but a lot of FPV drones, for example, are still assembled from Chinese-made components. These are components that could be acquired commercially in very large quantities. And so China is almost a silent partner in this war for both sides, more so for the Russians, as China is now implementing um, certain measures to prohibit the export and acquisition of drone technology of different types that they know will eventually end up in the war. But a lot of these are still assembled from Chinese components. There's a drive both in Russia and Ukraine to manufacture these components and drones domestically. So the import substitution drive is a very important policy, both for Ukraine and for Russia. Ukraine also gets a lot of their UAVs from NATO partners, and a lot of countries in the NATO and the European Union are supplying their UAVs to the Ukrainians. Russians are still getting a lot of components from China, and Russians are now again domesticating the original Iranian Shahed long-range drone design to manufacture what is supposed to be a wholly Russian system. But Russia also depends on a lot of Western components, microelectronics, which they get essentially bypassing the sanctions that have been imposed since 2022.
Mm-hmm. In terms of actual missions that these drones allow both sides to accomplish, what are we seeing that would have been unimaginable just 10 years ago? Right? What sort of new modalities are we seeing, and what sort of new attacks are we seeing that just we couldn't have imagined before?
Saturation of the battlefield with a large number of tactical UAVs. Prior to 2022, militaries could mass their forces. They could mass tanks, armored vehicles, artillery systems, electronic warfare systems, communication systems. You could have very large technical operations centers that would emit a large number of electronic signals. You could move in large formations on the field, mostly because tactical drones were far and few in between. And even if you were observed by a sort of high-flying ISR expensive drone, a strike may not always follow or may not always follow right away. Today, everything that I've just described is practically non-existent. You can't mass your forces anymore. You can't have your forces congregate in large quantities because a large grouping of forces will be observed by a fixed wing or a quadcopter drone or a long-range fixed wing drones. The data would be relayed back very quickly for follow-on strikes. And now there are quadcopter and fixed wing short-range ISR UAVs roaming the skies, again, day and night. And they're looking for targets, they're looking for signatures, heat signatures at night. They're looking for specific items to watch during the day. So some of the tactics and practices, which were organic to many militaries around the world, may no longer be effective in a conventional style of war that we're witnessing in Ukraine right now.
Mm-hmm. Does this provide some asymmetry in conflict now? Do you think drones are going to allow smaller nations to punch above their weight just because of, you now can no longer field that large column of tanks or soldiers?
If we look at the conflicts around the world that utilize technologies similar to those seen in Ukraine, Syria civil war, Israel-Gaza war, Israel-Hezbollah war, Sudan civil war in Myanmar, use of quadcopters by Mexican cartels against the Mexican military, and so on and so forth. We're seeing that a lot of these practices and tactics are indeed spreading far and wide, precisely because they're based on commercial technology that is still readily available. So right now there are manuals, there are instructions on how to build certain types of quadcopters, how to rig their commercial drone to drop munition, how to change the software, and so on and so forth. And those manuals, those tactics are available in large quantities. If you are observing the war in Ukraine, there's a lot of evidence on how to use different types of UAVs, both from Russians and from the Ukrainians. So a small military with a small military budget need no longer go after very exquisite, very expensive UAVs to make a point. It can actually invest in relatively cheap, in relatively expendable and readily available technologies to enable a drone capability. And of course, they should know rather, that their adversaries can do the same. There are now a lot of designs how to build fixed wing ISR drones on a budget. And those too can also be utilized as well. And of course, you can take a commercial agricultural drone. A lot of these are actually manufactured by China, and change it to an observation drone, to a bomber drone, to a drone that carries other drones to conflict, and so on and so forth. So it is likely that a lot of militaries around the world are taking note. A lot of militaries are copying, or at least trying to understand how all of this impacts their operations. And it's not just small militaries. China is also looking at the lessons from Ukraine. And in a recent article by China observers, they noted that China is looking at fielding FPV type drones, interceptor drones to go after adversarial UAVs, and just a very large number of cheap expendable UAVs to mask their capability. And I think this is a major lesson from the war in Ukraine that both militaries have moved away from relying on very expensive standalone platforms to now fielding a very large quantity of mass manufactured, mass used, cheap, expendable, attritable systems. Those that could be quickly fielded, quickly lost, and quickly replaced.
Mm-hmm. So what does this say then for global security? In terms of the use by insurgents or terrorist actors, is there anything that you're particularly concerned about?
Well, if many actors can actually utilize this technology, then I think global security is in for a shakeup. Certainly, it's not always possible to identify what drones are flying overhead, and we're witnessing that right now in the United States. Certainly, it's not possible to stop the flow of technologies and knowledge to different actors who are determined to acquire that knowledge and those technologies. Lots of non-state actors and terrorist groups, again, are looking at what is happening in Ukraine and in other conflicts around the world where these technologies are used. Again, a lot of this is facilitated by the fact that this technology is commercially available. We're not
Mm-hmm.
just talking about military grade drones, which are more expensive, much more difficult to acquire and field. We're talking a large number of commercial UAVs, which can be readily available at online or physical marketplaces. So as long as
Mm-hmm.
that availability exists, the threat also exists.
I suppose the thing that I worry about is the rate of development, right? If you look at frontline aircraft like the JSF, like the F-35, this takes years and years and years to develop. But here we have
It takes decades. It
startups.
actually takes decades.
But now we have startup companies providing drones in Ukraine, right? So, what's the impact of commercial input to the war? What's the impact on the spread of drone technology, and what impact is this going to have more generally on conflict?
Well, it's significant. In Ukraine war, both sides have to iterate and evolve very quickly. And if a specific drone or a drone capability is no longer effective, they have to field a replacement very quickly. They have to change the capability, or they have to modify the drone, or they have to field a new one. And this research development, testing, and evaluation cycle, um, to borrow a Department of Defense term, has shrunk from years, as you've indicated, and sometimes decades, to now mere months and weeks, and sometimes even days. So
Mm-hmm.
this is what the militaries have to be prepared for, that their adversaries may, in fact, field capabilities that change very rapidly. And the military that's serious about fielding their own capability and capacity on the large scale must also be ready to change rapidly and evolve rapidly as well.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about countermeasures. So you mentioned these fiber optic controlled drones. What are the main countermeasures that are being used, and what's most effective?
Well, there are essentially electronic warfare jamming capability where signals are jammed in general terms, and there are physical measures. And so sometimes those systems can be or those tactics can be effective by themselves. Oftentimes they're effective in combination. And
Mm-hmm.
so a comprehensive defense against UAVs involves signals intelligence, where you have to use technologies to identify frequencies and drones flying overhead to really determine if it's an adversarial UAV or a friendly UAV. It involves jamming capability, where you jam the adversarial signals. It involves physical protection of your position of your vehicles. Involves different types of camouflage practices where you don't reveal yourself readily to a UAV. It involves certain types of kinetic measures where you use anything from machine guns to short-range air defense systems to shotguns to go
Mm-hmm.
after the UAVs that have made it through. So again, it's a combination of all of the above that is usually effective, but this combination isn't always effective everywhere in the Ukraine war, for example, and the quality of different types of countermeasures also varies greatly. And so For example, on the Russian side, there's still no unified standard on how to conduct counter UAS, and different units do it differently. They rely on military grade technology, they can rely on commercial technology. A lot of UAVs, as we have just mentioned, are or they are essentially commercial technology, so they could be assembled quickly, sometimes by the soldiers themselves. Some electronic warfare and counter UAS technologies are likewise assembled from commercial components, oftentimes by soldiers themselves or by volunteers and startup communities that assist them on both sides. So the quality of EW and counter UAS technologies and tactics can also vary across the front. So the key for any military that's looking at the war in Ukraine is to develop a comprehensive set of standards that could be enforced, and a set of standards that can dictate and inform the military and the soldiers right there at the front what they should and should not be doing.
Are we seeing the introduction of AI to circumvent countermeasures?
Yes. So if we zoom out, artificial intelligence mechanisms are used to essentially parse through and analyze lots of data, right? There's lots of information coming from the front, satellite imagery, airplane imagery, lots of drone imagery, imagery collected by soldiers and data collected by soldiers themselves, imagery that's coming from social media. So all of that has to be understood. And some artificial intelligence mechanisms are used, certainly on the Ukrainian side, and they've publicly admitted so, to understand this battlefield data. In combat itself, when it comes to UAVs, we have limited AI in the form of terminal guidance. So an operator basically designates an object or a collection of pixels on their screen as a target. And the drone, once it basically captures that target, flies towards it on its own. And when that happens, there's no communication between the operator and the drone itself, so that minimizes the impact of EW and counter UAS. We don't yet have a large quantity of drones that can identify targets on their own and strike them. So the vast majority of UAVs, for example, flying today are remote control with a pilot firmly in the loop. We're seeing a growing share of target lock with using certain types of AI technologies, but the pilot is still very much involved because the pilot has to approve that specific target. But both sides are claiming that more AI capabilities are coming, and Ukrainians have actually claimed on multiple occasions, both by the militaries, by the military officers, as well as by certain pilots and volunteers, that they're going to field more autonomous UAVs in 2025 and in greater quantities as a leverage against Russian military's ability to field more soldiers repeatedly over and over and over again and continue to slowly advance despite their losses.
By that, do you mean that drones and AI are taking over the kill decision completely?
Well, that remains to be seen. It's not likely that a human will be completely out of the loop. And certainly we have a lot of AI claims coming from drone developers and technology developers, possibly as a way to sort of advertise their capabilities. I can't say for sure whether we're actually going to see a human completely out of the loop. That's not likely. But what is likely is that Ukraine is claiming more advanced AI capabilities in 2025, again, as a leverage against Russians. And Russians have been claiming for a while that their technology developers and UAV developers are likewise working with more autonomous capabilities for their UAVs. So it remains to be seen what that actually means in practice and how these technologies will actually act in combat.
Mm-hmm. But if you had to guess what the path to full autonomy is it going to be, in your mind, a loitering munition or one of these lock-on systems? What do you think the path will be?
Again, it's hard to predict right now. Things are changing so rapidly and so quickly that some of the predictions we made in 2022 and 2023 still haven't come to pass. And some of the technologies flying today were not anticipated altogether. Even at the beginning of this war. So again, I would hesitate to speak with certainty about this capability. We know that there's a lot of research and development happening. We know that there's a lot of efforts and investments in that area. We know that Ukraine is getting assistance from its NATO partners. We know there's a lot of AI development happening in Ukraine as well. We also know that is happening on the Russian side. What that will look like in 2025, I think remains to be seen. and we may be surprised. I'll give you an example. In 2022, some of the first instances of FPV drones were recorded early on in the conflict and throughout the year. But it was not possible to anticipate the mass scale application of FPV drones in 2023 going forward. So again, this may or may not happen with some of the AI claims and some of the artificial intelligence capabilities, which are now getting tested.
Mhm. So when I think of drones, I usually think of UAVs, flying vehicles. But we've also seen in the Black Sea the Russian fleet moving away from its main ports. Can you give some idea for both naval and ground assets? What is there that we're not seeing in the news, and what is there in general?
Well, you're right. UAVs usually grab the headlines, but unmanned surface vehicles, or USVs, fielded by Ukraine, have also grabbed a lot of headlines because they were a very cheap and effective way to essentially put a lot of pressure on the Russian Black Sea fleet, either in port or when the ships are out at sea. It's often difficult to sight and identify a USV moving forward. Oftentimes, you see it at the last second. In other instances, defenders operating aircraft or helicopters or even observation UAVs can spot USVs on approach because they don't move very fast. But for Ukraine, it was an asymmetric way to put a lot of pressure on the Russian Black Sea fleet, damage and destroy a lot of vessels. It didn't even force them out of certain locations. And the running joke, of course, is that a military without a navy or a country without a navy was able to do all of that to a country with one of the largest navies in the world. Ukrainians are continuing to develop their USV capabilities. A lot of USVs now carry, for example, observation and attack drones like FPVs. Some USVs actually carry short-range missiles to attack different types of targets. Russians are trying to copy that. They didn't need to develop a lot of USVs because there really weren't a lot of Ukrainian naval targets to attack. Now the Russian military is fielding its own USVs as a way to counter Ukrainian USVs, as a way to attack Ukrainian targets at sea or along the rivers as well. And the Russians are also trying to launch uh, different types of drones and munitions from their own USVs. But the Ukrainians are the movers and shakers in this
Mhm.
particular field, and they've demonstrated what a relatively small amount of investment in USVs can actually result. And it is also likely some of these tactics and concepts and technologies will be copied by other navies and militaries going forward. When it comes to unmanned ground vehicles, we see less of them in conflict simply because both sides, and certainly the Russian military, had to rethink the entire concept of fielding such systems. I'll give you an example. Prior to February 2022, prior to the invasion of Ukraine, Russia built and tested a number of fairly large to mid-size, expensive-looking UGVs with different sensors, weapons, and technologies. But those technologies were developed in the absence of the current drone threat, where anything that moves on the battlefield can be tracked and attacked. So it makes no sense to build a very expensive or a very large UGV unless you are 100% sure you can protect it against any and every type of threat. So what we're witnessing right now is, just like with quadcopters, just like with tactical UAVs, a very large number of small size, cheap, easily built, easily replaceable unmanned ground vehicle platforms for logistics and supply tasks to ease the soldier burden. For kamikaze attacks, where these ground drones are loaded with explosive mines and munitions and sent against the adversarial trenches, positions, dugouts, and so on. We're witnessing some of those in combat capacity or in a capacity that allows them to carry, for example, electronic warfare systems or antennas or anything like that. But the majority of these are used for supply roles, sometimes for evacuation roles, and sometimes for combat roles. But the defining characteristic is that they're relatively small, relatively cheap, easily put together, with intent to be easily lost. And so again, just like with UAVs, we're witnessing a different, just like with UAVs, we're witnessing the same um, pattern related to UGVs. Ukraine, again, led the way here. Ukraine has different types of UGVs that are already built and used in combat. It is building and fielding even more and is expected to field them in large quantities in 2025. Russians are also building a large number of them. And again, just like FPVs, just like commercial quadcopters, many of them are built from commercial components, readily available components that are that allow soldiers and volunteers and startups to quickly assemble them. And so theoretically, they could also be fielded in large quantities in relatively limited roles that are most important for the soldiers. So you want to ease the soldier burden to have them carry less. You want to use a UGV. Mm-hmm. You want to evacuate a soldier instead of sending a unit of 3 or 4 that will have to carry the soldier out, thereby presenting a very important target of opportunity for a drone. And there's lots of videos of drones attacking these evacuation units where it's not just the wounded soldier that ends up dying, but the soldiers who come to their rescue. So you want to send a UGV platform. That's not always effective, but we're seeing more of that. Kamikaze drones are used more and more, small ground platforms loaded with mines to attack adversarial positions at relatively short distances. And of course, both sides are also working on extending their capabilities and making them more sophisticated for more sophisticated types of attacks. But again, the underlying characteristic is the attritable nature of these technologies. For maritime drones, for ground drones, they're not built to last multiple missions. They're built to last maybe one or several missions at the most.
In terms of legacy systems then, are drones starting to make tanks, planes, ships obsolete? And a follow-up question to that is, which items are particularly at risk? I imagine large ticket items like ships are the most at risk of obsolescence.
Well, there's been a lot of debate about the fate of the tank after lots of videos of relatively inexpensive tactical drones damaging or destroying them altogether. There's been a lot of videos of these drones, especially loitering munitions, launched by Russians, attacking expensive Western-provided artillery systems and other systems. Obviously, there's evidence of Ukrainian USVs damaging expensive ships, which cost many magnitudes more than that USV. And so there's obviously a lot of questions. Can the legacy system survive? And when it comes to the tank specifically, there's been a lot of debate whether we should bury the concept and build something new. And yet, there's still no replacement for a tank in combat. I'll give you an example. One of the Russian bloggers talked about how his military should replace a tank. So, okay, we still need soldiers to be protected by something in combat or to follow something in combat. So we have a tactical platform, and that platform should be effective. Therefore, it should have a range of systems, but preferably something that can deliver a big punch. So we're talking about this platform with a relatively big cannon. But maybe those platforms shouldn't always be autonomous, simply because there's no replacing soldier experience on the field or an experience of a tanker or someone who has been soldiering for quite a while, right? There's no replacing that human intuition. So those systems have to be piloted in one form or another. So we end up with a tank in maybe a different format, right? We wanted to get rid of a tank, we end up with a tank. The current discussions usually point to a well-protected system, different types of components going into making that system. Perhaps it could be lighter, but also stronger. Perhaps it could carry a suite of systems without overburdening the tank with the weight of those systems, right? So again, we're not getting rid of a tank, but we're talking about a tank in a slightly different concept. Perhaps a tank or an armored vehicle of different form and function could be optionally manned, and certainly they could be accompanied by unmanned ground vehicles and their own UAVs, both for observation and for attacks against the enemy. So we're talking about basically manned-unmanned teaming concepts. And the same is also applied in the maritime domain, right? There's no replacing a naval vessel for the amount of armor, and there's no replacing a naval vessel for the amount of damage it can cause with its cannons and systems. No USV, no UAV can replace that. But those naval vessels have to be well protected going forward. They have to have their own counter UAS and different types of unmanned systems, technologies to accompany them into combat. And so what we're probably looking at is not necessarily getting rid of the old concepts, but basically mating those older concepts with the new concepts, where older legacy systems can have their own unmanned technologies or have their own defensive technologies, fast computational technologies, perhaps enabled by AI in one form or another, to deliver that very heavy punch, because the tank will still remain the king of the battlefield going forward. And even now, as we witness a lot of videos, for example, of tanks getting destroyed, there's more and more tanks which are not affected as much by UAVs, which are well protected and well commanded in combat.
When do you think we're going to see the last man in combat? Do you think we're starting to see the beginning of the end of manned conflict and manned navies and so on?
Well, we're certainly seeing the impact of unmanned technologies on manned operations in general. And prior to the war in Ukraine, there was a lot of theoretical discussion around the world on essentially slowly phasing out a soldier from the most dangerous tasks, from the most dangerous duties, and replacing them slowly but surely with different types of unmanned technologies and robotic systems. I think the war in Ukraine has demonstrated that in a conventional style conflict that can be protracted, that could be attritional in nature, there's still no replacing a human. After all, robots cannot take and hold the territory. Soldiers must do that. So we're not getting rid of soldiers at any given point anytime soon, but soldiers are going to be augmented and assisted by different types of technologies to make their missions a lot more effective than today. And I think this is probably going to be the discussion and the debates going forward, right? For example, lots of Russian military academics, lots of Russian military developers before the war were describing that moment when eventually soldiers may be replaced. But I think we are talking about a much more realistic and much sobered approach to how these autonomous technologies will impact the battlefield. Again, there's yet no replacing a soldier, and probably that won't happen anytime soon, because wars are ultimately about territory and resources, and those must be held by people, not by robots.
At the end of conflicts, you often see weapons flooding into the market, right? And so when this war in Ukraine ends, what do you think will be the impact of drones? What do you think we will see flood into the markets? What will be the impact more broadly?
We are already seeing discussions amongst the Ukrainian developers that they should be able to market and export their technologies to willing partners. We are witnessing Russians marketing some of the technologies used in the war to their international partners as well, such as Lancet and Kub drone and Orion UAV and many others. Again, there's lots and lots of note-taking by other militaries in other countries when it comes to the war in Ukraine. And there's lots of modifications to existing technologies based on what was witnessed in Ukraine and is witnessed in Ukraine, and based on how these technologies can be impacted by different types of countermeasures. So there's already a lot of marketing of weapons and systems used in Ukraine. Iran at one point bragged that some 24 countries are interested in their Shahed drone. Obviously, Turkey benefited from the use of its TB2 Bayraktar drone in Ukraine to market that UAV to lots of partners. And other countries are also trying to do the same as well. So we don't have to wait for this war to be over. The weapons market is already impacted by how UAVs and other technologies are fielded in Ukraine. And so a lot of willing partners are now looking to incorporate those lessons into the technologies that they're willing to buy.
Mm-hmm. So final question, because I know we have to wrap up. What is the next big evolution in drone warfare? What can we expect to see, do you think, in the coming years?
Well, certainly the impact of artificial intelligence is going to be significant. Again, we don't know to what extent, and again, I would hesitate to make any definitive statements. We're witnessed a very rapid evolution of interceptor drones against adversarial UAVs. So that's probably going to be something that will stay with us. And Ukraine is already talking about the development of long-range interceptors to go after Russian Iranian Shahed UAVs, and the Russians are probably going to do the same. Fiber optic drones are probably going to be a fixture for quite some time until some effective countermeasure is developed. And the combination of fixed wing and multi-rotor UAVs for different mission sets. I think, again, the biggest lesson from Ukraine is that those systems need not be very expensive, and they must be fielded in large quantities for greatest effect. So militaries are going to look for sort of that mass effect, large quantities of cheap, attritable, expendable systems that could be easily purchased, easily assembled, easily understood by pilots, and easily lost without the impact on the overall mission.
Sam Bendett, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.